Chapter 10, in the middle of the chapter, and we've been talking about the tzaddik, the difference between what is a perfect and an imperfect tzaddik, and about the need, the burning need to be able to change the world, not just to accept the fact that we can control the negative, but to actually change the world. That's the motivation of the tzaddik, okay? Or I should say the perfect tzaddik. So, what we're going to start to do tonight is we're comparing the two, the classification of an imperfect tzaddik versus the classification of a perfect tzaddik. So we have already started that conversation, which we are going to continue this evening. And in doing so, we're going to effectively learn two key principles tonight. The first is that a tzaddik is not a static definition. Meaning to say, not all tzaddikim look the same. Not all tzaddikim are the same. And then we're going to start to explore, please God, time allowing, we're going to start to explore the secret of the super tzaddik, which will start this evening and please God continue next week. So those are the two things that we want to have a look at, is that there's this spectrum of tzaddikim. So possibly when you speak about people being on the spectrum, they might be on the spectrum of being a tzaddik. And maybe we're actually complimenting them. Because there's a range of tzaddikim. So we're going to talk about that. But before we get there, let's just round off what we spoke about last week, which was that the big difference between the imperfect tzaddik and the perfect tzaddik is the difference between the person who is satisfied that there is no crime versus the person who will not rest until we have rehabilitated criminals. So the imperfect tzaddik, the reason their imperfection is that they are satisfied with the fact that there's no negativity left in their world, and that's good enough. Whereas the tzaddik gomer, the perfect tzaddik, is somebody who says, but we've got to change the world. How can it be that anywhere at all in the world there's any sense of negativity or toxic energy or whatever? We've got to transform all of the negative into positive. Now that is going to be a very key part of the rest of this chapter. And starting off first, as I say, by comparing a little bit more the perfect and imperfect tzaddik. So if you're looking inside the book, you are on page 42. And on page 42 itself, we are going to start from, you'll see that there's a full stop about almost 10, probably about 8 lines down from the top of the page. If you're looking on the screen, we're going to go back a little bit. Yeah, it's actually the top of our page, just after the full stop. Okay, so the word we're looking for over here is v'tzadik. That's the word that we're looking for, v'tzadik. Okay, so v'tzadik she'enoi gomer. Last week we learned that the flip side of love is hate, and the flip side of love is disgust. So if a person has a tremendously strong love for something or for someone, they will absolutely hate anything or anyone that tries to harm it. And likewise, we learned that if somebody absolutely loves something or someone, and then there is something in the world that gets in the way, that interferes with it, that could be harmful to it, we find that disgusting. We find it absolutely unacceptable. How can there be something in the world like that? How can there be such a force in the world that could interfere with or that could undermine something which is so important to us? So that's on the tzaddik gomer front, because the tzaddik gomer is living with so much love of God that anything which gets in the way of connection to God, whether it's in the way of my connection, whether it's in the way of the world's connection to God, anything which gets in the way of connection is absolutely abhorrent, and he hates with every fiber of his being, and is going to do something to change that. So by comparison, v'tzadik she'enoi gomer, page 42, the approximately 8 line from the top of the page, just by the full stop over there, the word v'tzadik. V'tzadik she'enoi gomer. Why do we call that tzaddik? This was a question we had from the beginning of the chapter. How could it be that there's somebody who is a tzaddik, and the definition of a tzaddik is really somebody who has the spiritual mastery? How can you call somebody an imperfect tzaddik? It sounds like a complete contradiction in terms. So now we're coming back to revisit that question. How could you be a tzaddik and it's not perfect? We all imagined that tzaddik equals perfect. So here he tells us, tzaddik she'enoi gomer. Now, perfect is not the right word, even though it's the word that we use. And it's one of the things that we do. We tend to mistranslate things. It's one of the occupational hazards of learning in a foreign language. So we're learning in Hebrew, which is not our first language, and then we use translations that make things easier for us to understand. The truth of the matter is, we should actually be using accurate terms. So now, let's have a look. We say tzaddik gomer, we've translated as perfect tzaddik. But the word gomor does not mean perfect. The word gomor means complete. A complete tzaddik. And then, by comparison, tzaddik she'enoi gomor, although we will conveniently translate it as a tzaddik who is imperfect, or an imperfect tzaddik, the more appropriate way to translate it would be a tzaddik who is not complete. Here, the Alter Rebbe will describe to us what's not complete. See, because this is the problem. When we hear those words, not complete, we fall right into the trap of quantitative measures. What do I mean by that? So let's use this example. If you are working on a project, let's say you're at work, you're working on a project, and the project has 10 steps that have to be completed, and somebody only does 9 out of the 10 steps, what will we say? The project is incomplete. Right? If you've got a puzzle, you've got a 1,000-piece puzzle, and one piece is missing, you'll say the puzzle is incomplete. So where our mind goes naturally when we use a word like incomplete, our mind goes to the missing piece. Right? So if you talk about tzaddik, in our minds, tzaddik is pious. So incomplete tzaddik means some part of their piety is missing. And that's where we get stuck, but isn't a tzaddik a pious individual? So actually be a pious individual who's not really completely pious. Well, then maybe you're not a tzaddik. That's where we get stuck, because we're looking for the missing piece. Here, we're going to learn something else. That tzaddik she'enoi gomor does not mean that there's a piece of the person missing. What it means is she'enoi soinei hasitra achro betachlis hasina. That this tzaddik is absolutely dedicated to Hashem. Because in our minds, if the tzaddik is incomplete, maybe they're not totally dedicated. In our minds, if there are 613 mitzvahs, we imagine that a tzaddik does 613. And if a person does 612, which in our mind is incomplete, then they can't be a tzaddik. So that's why we've grappled with this concept of the incomplete tzaddik. The Alter Rebbe says that's not what it is. Tzaddik she'enoi gomer is not a description of that person's observance. It's not a description of their dedication. It's a description of their hatred. She'enoi soina sitra achra betachlis hasina. Their hatred of evil is not complete. That's a radical insight. Their hatred of evil is not complete. Let's understand that for a moment. So, because we are so used to measuring things by their quantity, we use expressions like, so-and-so is more religious than I am. Now, that might be factual. That person keeps a higher standard of kashrus than I do. That person keeps Shabbos, I don't keep Shabbos. That person learns Torah every day, I only learn Torah twice a week, whatever. So, it might be factual. That person is more religious than I am. It's factual. But because we're so caught up in that quantitative measure of people, so we think that if you go far enough adding more and more and more quantity, eventually you get enough quantity to be a tzaddik. So if there's a checklist of 613 categories, and out of those 613 categories, there are then numerous subcategories. And if you're doing all of those, then you're a tzaddik. Then we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what a tzaddik is. And then we start thinking, I really believe so-and-so is a tzaddik. Why? Because they do more quantum of Judaism than I do. And then we get disappointed when they don't behave the way that we would expect. I don't get it. You're supposed to be a tzaddik. How could you behave that way? So as long as we are caught up in this quantitative measure of spiritual development, number one, we will believe that just a few more steps might actually get us there. And then we get disappointed because we do those few more steps and we're no closer to being a tzaddik than we were. So people get disappointed and they say, but I've been trying so hard and I've been doing so much and I've changed my life so fundamentally and I've upgraded my standards and I daven with a lot of intention and I learned so much. Why am I not there yet? I've added more pieces to my puzzle. And then you start wondering, what's the missing piece of my puzzle? So if we have this quantitative measure of spiritual growth and progress, we're consistently disappointed in ourselves and in others. That's the second thing that happens. So I think this person is a tzaddik. Why do I think they're a tzaddik? Because they had the most profound influence on my life. And whether we like it or not, it's kind of inescapable that we always use ourselves as the measure by which we measure anything else. So if you inspired me, you must be a tzaddik, because you know what it takes to inspire me. You know what it takes to have that kind of influence that actually got me to change my... You must be a tzaddik. And then in our minds, tzaddik means you've got all the pieces of the puzzle. You're perfection. Then what happens one day, and any person who has been deeply inspired by a mentor in their lives will eventually hit this brick wall where that person lets me down, either personally or in their behavior, or they weren't as knowledgeable as I thought they were, or they weren't as pious as I thought they were, or they weren't as patient as I thought they were. Hey, what happened to the tzaddik? So we have to appreciate that a tzaddik, as we're going to see later in this chapter, a tzaddik is a rare breed, because a tzaddik is not just the quantum of a whole lot of behaviors that are aligned with the Torah. A tzaddik is somebody who lives in a completely different universe to us. You can have people who are doing all of the right things in Judaism, and they still have the same distractions that we have, and the same temptations that we have, and the same weaknesses that we have. They're just better at managing them. That doesn't mean they're a tzaddik. A tzaddik no longer has those challenges. So therefore, how could a tzaddik be einoi gomor? It's not the tzaddik that's missing. It's the hatred the tzaddik has for what is wrong in life. That's what's lacking. That's what's incomplete. That's incomplete. Let's maybe use an example that we could relate to. Right? Use an example we could relate to. Let's imagine for a moment that there's a married couple. Right? Husband and wife. Husband and wife go out with a few friends for dinner. Old friends. Turns out that one of the husband's friends, is a bit rough about the edges. And he says things that can be a little bit hurtful, it could be a little bit insulting. So it so happens that this friend says something inappropriate that insults the wife. In other words, the one guy insults the other guy's wife. Now we all know how this is going to end, right? Who's going to be punished? For sure the husband. For sure the husband is going to be punished. Why is the husband going to be punished? And when is the husband going to be punished? At home. So they go back home, and he had a great time with his friends, whatever, everything was wonderful, it was so amazing. Comes back home. First they get into the car, and his wife's not talking to him. And he's not quite sure what happened over here. Why is his wife not talking to him? And he's trying this, did you have a good evening? Cold shoulder. And eventually it emerges that what happened? Why is she upset? Why is the wife upset? Because he didn't stand up for her. He didn't stand up for her. And he says, yeah, the next words are like suicidal. He says, yes, but he was only joking. So in his mind, by saying that, what he's going to do is alleviate, mitigate, soften the blow. Oh, come on, it's just how the guys talk to each other. It's not personal. It wasn't really directed. I guarantee you he forgot about it as soon as he said it. He never intended. If he would know you're upset, oh, blah, 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 blah. And what's that doing to the wife? Each level, each phrase that he's using, each time they say, what's it doing? It's making her feel more hurt. So you, the person who's supposed to love me, who's supposed to have my back, who's supposed to protect me, you think it was okay. Now I want to ask you a question. Does this mean he's a bad husband? He might be the most wonderful husband. He's attentive. He provides. He's loving. He helps with the kids. He does dishes. He's an amazing human being. They actually have an amazing relationship. But he's a husband she'eino gomor. He's an incomplete husband. What does it mean, incomplete husband? Not that he's an incomplete husband. That the degree to which that love of his wife is non-negotiable hasn't reached the point where I cannot tolerate. Sorry, you don't speak to my wife that way. That's not okay. I don't care who you are. I don't care what your intention. I don't care if you're my friend. This is my wife that we're talking about. You don't talk to my wife that way.
Maybe he agreed with his friend.
Well, if he agreed with his friend, then he's worse off than a tzaddik who is incomplete. That's what's happening over here. The tzaddik she'eino gomor, you can't fault the person. They're dedicated, they're pious, they're conscientious, they're learning, they're davening, they're doing mitzvahs. They've worked to the point where they no longer have the temptations that creep into their mind. But somebody insults God? I'm sure they didn't mean it. Maybe they just didn't have the right education. Maybe, it's the sign of the times. This is the generation that we live in. This is how people talk. It's what they've been fed through the media. Can you fault this person? Are they doing something wrong? They're not doing something wrong. But it's symptomatic of the fact that the degree of love that this person has for Hashem is not absolute. Because if it were absolute, their inability to tolerate this insult to Hashem would be absolute. What's not complete? What's not complete is their reaction, their sense of indignation. That's why the word hatred obviously has a negative connotation. But their indignation. I'll go back to the example, right? Hashem comes to Abraham and he says to Abraham, there's a terrible group of people. They live in this area called Sodom and Amorah. I'm going to kill them all. So what does Abraham say? Okay, you're God. You obviously know what you're doing. I defer. One less table that I have to set for my free hotel in the middle of the desert. That's not what Abraham does. What does Abraham do? Indignation. He can't accept the thought that there are people in this world that cannot be transformed. It's an insult to Hashem. How could we accept this? How could we tolerate it? Listen to the words that he says. Hashoifet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. The ultimate judge of all beings should not perform justly. He wasn't saying that Hashem is going to kill people who don't deserve to be killed. If Hashem decided that they deserve to be killed, there is no greater truth than that. He's saying, is it true that you, God, the one who represents justice in the world, cannot find a way to fix these people? You can't turn the criminals into rehabilitated citizens. Your only way to deal with them is to get rid of them. That's a tzaddik gomor. He can't. His inability to accept that something should exist in a negative state, he just can't accept it. It's an absolute indignation. You're going to read in this week's parasha, right? This week's parasha, you get Moshe goes up Mount Sinai. He receives the tablets. He receives the Torah directly from Hashem. Hashem broadcasts at least the 10 Commandments, at least the first 2 of the 10 Commandments, right across the entire world. The Jewish people are standing there. This is an undeniable experience. What happens? Moshe is still on the mountain. He hasn't even come down yet. And they're already making a golden calf. And Hashem says to Moshe, says, there's nothing. I can't help these people. Let me go. I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to annihilate them. What does Moshe say? What does Moshe say? Take me out. I cannot be part of a Torah that doesn't have a way to fix the bad in this world. Take me out of your Torah. Because his indignation, his inability to accept that we just write people off, or we just, relegate certain elements of the world to the darkness of Klippa, he can't accept that. That's why when he used the expression over here, hate, or we use the expression over here, disgust, it's not disgust at the people, it's disgust at the how can it be that there's a circumstance in this world that cannot be transformed, that cannot be rehabilitated? So that tzaddik she'enoi gomer, the tzaddik that is not absolutely complete. What is not absolutely complete? That inability. He's a more tolerant individual. Maybe he'll be much more popular. I don't know. He might be. Might be a lot more popular because he's so tolerant. So v'kol she'ena sino uva'mius betachlis. So the formula works as follows. Any person who lives without this absolute indignation, this absolute rejection of something which is bad, al korchach nishar eze shemetz ave v'tainug lisham. The only reason why you don't absolutely reject something negative must be because you actually appreciate it just a little bit. Let's go back to the husband example. Maybe he also laughed at the joke. He didn't think it was so objective. It was funny. It was inappropriate. He shouldn't have said it. I'll speak to him tomorrow, whatever. But it was a little bit funny. Come on, admit. It was a little bit funny. It was inappropriate. It was a little bit funny. And even if he's not going to say that to his wife, in his mind, he sees a little bit of the humor in it. That's why he's not so worked up about it. Any person who does not completely reject something which is unhealthy, any person who doesn't completely reject something which is toxic, which is evil, obviously still has a little bit of personal connection to that evil. You want to look around at our world? We have a million examples in our world today. Look, Israel's reaction is a little bit too much. I heard that statement recently, yes? In the beginning it was justified, but now it's gone too far. Okay, so you also like Hamas a little bit. Otherwise you would never say that. You would never say it. The oncologist never says, look, I think we've hit this tumor a little bit too hard, and now we're going to stop. We need a little bit of a cease chemo, which is the medical term for a ceasefire, yeah? But a little bit of a cease chemo. Why? Because, you're crazy, An oncologist can't talk that way. An oncologist has to say, this is something we hate with every fiber of our being. We have to get rid of it. Again, whether get rid means destroy or whether get rid means rehabilitate, the tzaddik would always opt for rehabilitate. Sometimes Hashem says there's no rehabilitation. You've got to destroy Sodom and Amorah. That's how it is. But the tzaddik can't live with the fact that there is cancer in this world. He can't live with the fact that there's ignorance in this world. He can't live with the fact that there's hatred in this world. He can't live with the fact that there's rejection of God in this world. Because if you can handle any one of those things, that means there's a little bit of it going on inside. We have a principle, very interesting principle in Judaism, that is the principle of what we call everything could exist within a person in a far more subtle way than it is out there in the world. And therefore, when we take umbrage with what's going on in the world, we first have to look in the mirror and see if it's within ourselves. In other words, there's a very interesting and well-known, you want to call it a parable or illustration from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says, nothing that you see or hear is by chance. So if you see something or you hear it, it's because right now Hashem is sending you that message. The question you have to ask yourself is, why? Why does Hashem want me to see this now? Why does Hashem want me to hear this now? And then various stories about Hasidim of the Baal Shem Tov and various experiences that they had, and then they came back to the Baal Shem Tov to say, we saw this and it really caught our eye and we don't know what we're supposed to learn from it, so please teach us. But when you see another person behaving in a particular way, so the Baal Shem Tov said there's a very intriguing litmus test that a person should use. So can we come up with an example? Here's an example. A Jewish person is on the front page of the newspaper. Now that's never a good thing, right? It's never a good thing for a Jewish person to be on the front page of the newspaper. Why is this Jewish person on the front page of the newspaper? Because God forbid they were caught in some kind of a scam. Right? This was the perpetrator of a particular scam. What's our reaction? Look in the newspaper, and you see somebody with a, what's our reaction? 90% of the time, anger. Oh, why does this person have to expose the Jewish community in this way? Why does this person have to behave this way? We get all angry. We get all worked up about it. Occasionally, very rarely, our reaction is going to be Nebuch. You know how terrible it must be for somebody to have lost their way so badly. So the Baal Shem Tov says that's a litmus test. If our immediate reaction to somebody else being in a bad way is that we feel some level of sympathy, compassion for them, that's a healthy response. That means we're acknowledging that they're a mess and they need help. And I'm not talking over here about somebody who's the victim of their scam. That's a different story. I'm saying we're just reading the paper and our reaction should be, it's terrible. It's terrible that somebody should land up in such a bad place. Maybe there's a way we can help them. But the Baal Shem Tov says if the reaction is anger, that's because it's a bit too close to home, because maybe there's some area in our lives that we are not absolutely ethical. So this feels a bit too, subconsciously, feels a little bit too close to home, and therefore I'm getting angry. I'm getting angry because it exposes me. So an interesting litmus test. Now, here's a guy who's just ripped off the community for $100 million. I'm not doing that. Am I doing that? I'm not doing that. I mean, I wouldn't even know how to do that, right? So I don't have this issue. Why am I getting angry? So you got to start looking. Maybe what I'm doing that's not so ethical is on such a subtle level that I consider myself a moral person. I consider myself an ethical person, I'm willing to excuse that particular behavior. So it could be, I don't know, what are the classic examples of what people do that they claim to be ethical? You know what? I'm at the restaurant. I'm going to take a thing of sugar home. I don't know if people still do that kind of thing. I'm going to take it home.
This was at hotels taking towels.
Towels from the hotels. There you go. People come from hotels. They have robes and towels and slippers and mice like that. But everybody does it. So the point is, when a person has a much more subtle version of the same thing going on in their lives, their reaction towards it is going to be very different to if it's something that's completely out of, there's no way. Right? So for example, if a person were to say something like, I'm sure they had a good reason. Right? I'm sure they had a good reason. That means to tell you the person's thinking, I'm also guilty. That's why I need to defend them. Right? The tzaddik doesn't ever have this problem. The tzaddik gomer, the complete tzaddik, doesn't have this problem. It's not part of my reality. It's not part of my reality. So I don't feel any attachment, and therefore I'm not going to defend it. And I can call it out for what it is and say it's got to change. The imperfect tzaddik who's not getting to that degree of reaction is obviously just a little bit comfortable with it. Just a little bit comfortable with this darkness in our world. Not comfortable, God forbid, that I would live that way, behave that way, whatever the case be. But, it's how Hashem created the world. So to put this into the language of the Tanya, what it means is, the process of a person going through the spiritual transformation to become like a tzaddik is removing filthy clothes. So this person hasn't removed all of the dirt. There's still a little bit of dirt on themselves. So therefore, they're not so, about the dirt on somebody else. That, it's completely off the topic, but that joke about the guy who wants to join a yeshiva, and they tell him if you want to join the yeshiva, you have to know how Talmudic logic works. So he says, what's Talmudic logic? So the fellow says to him, 2 men go down a chimney. One comes out clean, one comes out dirty. Which one is going to wash their face? It's a whole thing. I'm not going to go into it's not for now. But the point is, one of the arguments over there is that the guy with a clean face is going to wash his face. Because he'll look and he'll see the other person has a dirty face, so he thinks he has a dirty face. Whereas the guy with a dirty face looks at the other person and says, he has a clean face, I'm probably fine. Right? So the way that we look at other people, what we see in other people, has a tremendous impact in how we respond and how we react. Person who looks at the world and says, listen, I also have a little bit of schmutz still on my face. I'm not going to make a big fuss yet about the fact that you have schmutz on your face. Subconsciously, without realizing that that's what's going on in our lives, we're just a little bit too comfortable with the inappropriate areas of life, and therefore we don't put on comment. And I'll tell you the fascinating thing about it. While here we're talking about a very, very subtle level, truth of the matter is the Gemara talks a lot about the way in which people speak and what it illustrates about them. So, for example, the Gemara tells this story. The Gemara says that there were a few Kohanim, and the Kohanim used to get, when they were on duty in the Beis Hamikdash in the temple, they used to get a little portion every single week. Whoever was on duty, you got a portion from the 12 special loaves of the Lechem HaPanim, the special bread that was brought in the Beis Hamikdash every Friday. So you would get, the Shabbos that you were on duty, you would get the loaves that had just been removed from the Beis Hamikdash. So there are 3 Kohanim complaining about how small the piece they got was. So the one says, I got like a bean. That's how small it was. The other guy says, I got like a lentil. That's how small it was. They were probably exaggerating. And the other guy says, I got a piece of the lechem hapanim that was like the tail of a lizard. Immediately, they launched an investigation into whether or not he was really a Kohen. What did he do? He said, I got it like a piece of a lizard. Because a lizard is one of the 8 creatures that makes a person impure. If you're a Kohen and you are completely aligned with the temple, which is a place of purity and holiness, then it should be totally objectionable to you to think about impurities. So here is a Kohen who, while he's on duty, his mind, where's his mind? His mind is on lizards, on impure creatures. So we start saying, whoa, could you really be a Kohen? Could you really be somebody who belongs in the space of holiness, who has the special designation in the community, if your head is in a place of impurity? He didn't even realize. He didn't realize there was something wrong with it. Never entered his mind, because when a person is in a state of comfort with something that's not healthy, they don't even realize that it's unhealthy. I tell you, it's another interesting version of the same kind of concept. So recently, and I don't know if you were there, but recently I had somebody sitting in some context. I don't remember where it was, if it was at the Kiddush or if whatever, and they used a swear word. The guy suddenly caught himself, and you could see he was very embarrassed. And he said to me, "I have never sworn in front of a rabbi before. I apologize." I'm thinking to myself, there are a whole lot of other people who don't seem to have this problem. They don't seem to feel that guilt. Why? Because when you're so comfortable in something which is inappropriate, you don't even realize anymore that's inappropriate. This is the way we talk. There are certain societies in the world where the language that people use in the course of ordinary conversation, for us, it's shemtzach, we're embarrassed, we would never speak that way. When you become really comfortable with something which is inappropriate, you say it in front of people you should never have said it in front of. So that's what we're saying about the tzaddik who is an incomplete tzaddik. Any person who could still tolerate and not be completely riled up by those things that are inappropriate must be because they have a certain level of comfort in the world that is inappropriate. So tzaddik she'eino gomer, the tzaddik is not yet completely protected from the world of impurity. Velochein lo nefach letoiv mamash. Any person who is still attached in any way to something which is negative doesn't have the power to transform it to become positive. Why would they? You can only change something if you realize that it is so unhealthy, so objectionable, so toxic that it's got to change. But if you're still living in that world, you don't feel it's so toxic. Right? So there's an expression, it doesn't exactly match what we're learning over here, but there's an expression that we use in Torah, which is knowing the disease is half the cure. And what that means, obviously, is that until you know what you have to treat, you can't treat it. But spiritually, it's a similar kind of thing. As long as a person is still living in that world, how can they possibly fix that world? How can they change the world? How can they even know that there's something wrong with being in that world? So we're not saying over here that the tzaddik is living in the world of impurity. We're just saying that the tzaddik hasn't completely transformed the impurity within themselves, because they still have some level of emotional attachment or some level of personal attachment to that impurity. So I can't change it. It's still part of me. Let's put it from this perspective. Somebody's a surgeon, and they happen to be related to the patient who needs the surgery, right? So it's not always a good idea. Why is it not a good idea? Because they're attached. And when you have some investment, you have some emotional attachment to the subject that you have to work on, maybe you won't have the objectivity that you need in order to do the surgery properly. So you'd much rather be under the knife of somebody who has no skin in the game, excuse the pun, than somebody who cares deeply about you, because just that emotion could cause them to make misjudgment. And that's why you always hear these stories, of recusing people from a case because they have personal involvement in the case, or from being involved in a medical team, or you don't want the guy whose job it is to be the head of a group of commandos to be the person whose family was taken out by the terrorists, because then it's too emotional. You've got to retain this level of objectivity. So as long as the tzaddik, the tzaddik who is not completely disconnected from the world of impurity, they can't turn it around. They can't transform it. They're not. How could they? They're still plugged in. מאחר שיש לי איזה אחיזה עדיין בבגודים הצויים אלו שהוא בוטל במיעוטו וכלו חושי ולכן נקרא צדיק ורע כפוף ובוטל לוי. But we have to just again balance what we're saying over here. That tzaddik, who is this so-called incomplete tzaddik, whatever toxicity is still in their system is so negligible you would never notice it under the most powerful spiritual microscope. And therefore the language that we use to describe this tzaddik is ra, whatever negativity might have existed in their world, Botel and kafufu botel loy is completely under their jurisdiction. So going back to the example that we used about something that falls into something else, from a kashrut perspective. So if you've got the little bit of meat that falls into the milk, or the little bit of milk that falls into the meat, so halachically, when there's a certain ratio, 60-1, it's as if the objectionable stuff is not there, because we've got enough of the good stuff to cancel it. So and if I brought a microscope, what would I find? I'd find it there. I'd find the molecules there. That's how it is, right? But it doesn't matter that it's there for all practical purposes. It doesn't exist. In the tzaddik v'ra-loi's world, for all practical purposes, whatever negativity might have been part of their reality doesn't exist. The only catch is it's still part of their makeup, still part of their DNA. The neural pathways are still there. So they can't just say, I'm going to step back, turn everything into, they're not there yet. And because we've spoken about this contrasting reality of the things that we despise being inversely proportionate to the things that we love, so if the tzaddik she'eino gomer, the imperfect tzaddik, is not yet in a stage where he absolutely abhors anything which is contrary to what Hashem wants, then obviously that's a symptom of the fact that he doesn't love Hashem yet absolutely. So where is he einoi gomer? Where is he incomplete? He's incomplete in having the highest form of love for God possible, which is an intensely developed state to be in. It's a highly spiritually evolved person. So from our vantage point, standing on a platform that is much lower spiritually than the tzaddik, we look at this person, we marvel, they're incredible. But on an objective scale, they're still not complete. They're still not completely where a human being is ultimately, I don't want to say expected, because not everybody's expected to be a tzaddik, but ultimately capable of reaching. And then he continues to tell us, that tzaddik who is incomplete, we're not talking here about a person, we're talking about a status, is such a broad spectrum that there could be literally tens of thousands of points along that range. Why? Because there are so many different degrees to which the person could have neutralized whatever negativity was inside of themselves. Right? Where the ratio of how much positive to negative there is inside the person, and is using effectively halachic measurements over here. It might be a 60-to-1 ratio, it might be a 1,000-to-1 ratio, maybe a 10,000-to-1 ratio. Effectively, what he's saying is that once you're on the scale of not being 100% in love with Hashem with every fiber of your being, and therefore having some degree of tolerance of the things that are inappropriate, there's a very, very wide range of what that could mean. From our perspective, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between one tzaddik and the next. They are so much more advanced than us, we wouldn't begin to understand. But if it's the tzaddik doing an introspection, they could say, I've progressed a little bit. Now, instead of having a 1 in 10 bit of negative in my system, I have a 1 in 100 bit of negative in my system. So it's valuable for their introspection. But it's not really valuable for us. The Alter Rebbe called the Tanya, the other name that he called at least the first section of the Tanya, is Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book that is designed for those of us who are aspiring to reach the spiritual platform called a Beinoni, which is the so-called intermediate person, or better translated as the ultimate goal for the intermediate person. The Alter Rebbe also wrote a book called Sefer Shel Tzadikim, the handbook for the tzaddik. And that book was destroyed in a fire, and he never rewrote it. Why? Because most people don't need that book. The vast majority of us, this is what we've just learned over here is valuable information, but it's not the kind of information that's going to impact us in the now, in our spiritual journey. So it's valuable for us to know that it exists, and it's valuable for us to know, as he says over here, this is what makes for the very broad range of tzaddikim throughout the generations, which, by the way, I do think sometimes confuses us, because we tend to think of a tzaddik as some kind of homogeneous reality, where everybody is all the same kind of tzaddik. And that's not the case. And that's why you hear all these stories and different people and tzaddikim, and then you have tzaddikim who have their own rebbes, and it gets a little confusing. So we need to understand that there's a broad range of tzaddikim. Kidisa b'Gemara, as the Gemara says, the Tamneisa alfei tzaddikim kaimei kamei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that there are 18,000 tzaddikim that stand before God, or perhaps what it's saying over here is there's 18,000 different types of tzaddik that stand before God. But all of them, the ones we're describing now, fall into the category of what is called the tzaddik she'eino gomer, the person who has not yet reached a point where it's absolute. You're absolutely boots and all connected to Hashem, dedicated to Hashem, cannot tolerate even the slightest hint or whiff of something which is contrary to Hashem, and therefore you will work with every fiber of your being to turn it into something positive. That is not what an imperfect tzaddik is. The imperfect tzaddik is living in a beautiful spiritual place, very dedicated to Hashem, but still able possibly to accommodate that there might be some negative in this world. So I thought this evening we would get to the super tzaddik, which we haven't, but please God, next week we shall start to talk about the so-called secret of the super tzaddik, the unique term that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai uses to refer to the super tzaddik, and two interpretations of what that unique term is actually supposed to mean. Again, is it something that's relevant in our lives? Not so much, because none of us is really anywhere close to being a tzaddik. We're many lifetimes away from being a tzaddik. And yet, on the other hand, it's worthwhile for us to know. So when we learn about a tzaddik in the Torah, we have a sense of what we're talking about. And, just to be able to identify within that, which are the perfect tzaddikim, and, and how we should obviously be learning from them. But please God, we'll continue that next week.